Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress and I'll be your host for the next hour. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Remember yesterday we discovered that according to the decrees of the popes, that governments that do not obey the papacy, governments that have arisen as a result of usurpation or revolution against the papal kingly power, such as the United States, who revolted against the kingly power of England, is a de jure, or rather a de facto government. That is, a government that exists in fact, but it is illegitimate. And therefore, being illegitimate based on a usurpation or a revolution against a legitimate power, that being England, no oath of allegiance is taken to this government is lawful. And they are no oaths at all. Rather, they are perjuries. And it is also bound up in Roman Catholic canon law that such governments, de facto, as the United States government, while it may exist for a time, is merely a usurpation of the rightful government, which is a papal monarchy. And that when such time arises or an opportunity presents itself, Romanists within the country, in concert with the papacy and whatever other foreign powers that the Pope can align, are to overthrow this illegitimate de facto government and install in its place a papal dictatorship. Very, very prudent is the efforts of the Vatican, knowing full well that until the opportunity presents itself and the successful replacement of the de facto government can be done safely, the Roman Catholic Church has to be very, very prudent in its behavior. And such as we find the Roman Catholic Church in this country today, although they've gained so much influence now in the country after Vatican Council II and the ecumenical movement, that they're being less prudent. They're obviously trying to take over the government and make this a quote-unquote Christian nation, which is not Christianity at all. It's Roman Catholicism. Now, we're on page 591 of the book. We ended yesterday at the beginning of the first full paragraph, but for continuity, I'll read a few sentences previous. It says, "Hence he reasons that as the original obligation of obedience to the old monarchies, the only form of government which he considers as known to the divine law has not been impaired by these iniquities," in other words, these revolutions or these temporary setbacks, and he calls them consummated facts, which is talking about the de facto government of the United States, and cannot be impaired by the substitution of new and illegitimate allegiance for it, the papacy, as the representative and divinely appointed guardian of the monarchical power, has the legitimate right to sweep out of existence, whenever it shall become prudent to attempt it, everything that shall stand in the way of his original and primary obedience. And hence also the oath of allegiance to the United States with those who accept the doctrine of papal infallibility has no other than a temporary binding force, because being illegitimate and unjust, it is perjury and no oath at all. So as long as the government of the United States carries the definition, the papal definition of de facto, no oath is binding upon a Roman Catholic in the country. As a matter of fact, the papacy goes one further, and we'll get into this later in the chapter. That oath isn't binding to anybody, Catholic or not, because the Pope rules supreme over every man, woman, and child on the planet, whether he be Roman Catholic or a heretic. The Pope's jurisdiction cannot be limited just to Catholics. If he is indeed, as he claims, the divine right ruler of the earth and Christ's vicar on earth, he will tolerate no restriction to his jurisdiction. And that doesn't mean just geographical jurisdictions, but human jurisdictions. Now, we'll continue where we left off yesterday, the first full paragraph on page 591. Thus always reasons the papal monarchist, who invariably argues so as to make everything center in the proposition that the bulk of mankind are fit only to be governed, not to govern. He and the political monarchists start from this standpoint. Do they not differ? They do not differ in their process of reasoning, except in this, that the former never fails to concentrate everything in the papacy as the legitimate source of all power, because it is the only authorized interpreter of the divine law. That is, the papacy is the only authorized interpreter of the divine law to which all mankind must become subject, and is sufficiently comprehensive to include the temporal and the civil power, as the greater includes the lesser. I mean, R.W. Thompson finds so many artistic ways to describe the all-encompassing power of these popes. And these aren't just blind assertions. These are written directly in Roman Catholic canon law. This is not anti-Catholic bigotry. This is simply Rome speaking for herself through her own canon laws. Now it says, those who defend the claim of papal supremacy in this sense see, or pretend to see, in the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, the act of God, consummated only through the instrumentality of the Roman Catholic Church, specially chosen for that purpose. You comprehend what he's just saying? Something that I reiterated on my website yesterday on my last installment, that the Roman Catholic Church considers it an act of divine providence that Christopher Columbus, under the auspices of Spain's Roman Catholic king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, and sanctioned by the Pope, who, by the way, was one of the most wicked popes in the papal history, of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, sent and financed the expedition of Christopher Columbus to come and discover the New World. And since he founded, or discovered, quote-unquote, the New World, it was just a perfect demonstration of how God upholds and supports and defends and sanctions and blesses the Holy Roman Catholic Church and its Pope. And Christopher Columbus, just like the United States placing the American flag on the moon, Christopher Columbus planted the papal flag on this hemisphere, and that is the papacy's claim to fame in this hemisphere. It's his claim of jurisdiction. And the papacy is not about to relinquish the Western Hemisphere as a legitimate jurisdiction for his divine right rule. And whether the revolution of the United States away from England or not was a Protestant endeavor blessed by God or not, the Pope doesn't care. He's not about to let the United States or any portion of the Western Hemisphere slip from his jurisdictional grip. Okay, so in Roman Catholic history, in papal canon law, the act of Columbus in discovering the West is just evidence of God's sanction of the papacy. That's what the papacy believes, and that's what the papacy teaches its people. He says, those who defend the claim of papal supremacy in this sense see, or pretend to see, in the discovery of America by Columbus, the act of God consummated only through the instrumentality of the Roman Catholic Church, specially chosen for that purpose. The Roman Catholic Church, specially chosen by God for the purpose of discovering the United States of America and imposing his jurisdiction. And you know what else the Roman Catholic Church brags about? That the discovery of this hemisphere providentially came at a time that allowed it to prepare for and to repay the papacy for the jurisdiction that it lost during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. That's how the Roman Catholic Church views the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, that it was God's way of repaying the papacy for the rebellion that was brought about in Europe by the Protestant Reformation. Again, a claim that God sanctions the papacy and protects and preserves the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, they have always considered this fact as having conferred jurisdiction upon the Pope to govern the new continent in whatsoever concerns the faith and the divine law, including necessarily, in their view, such direction of temporal affairs as required to make them conform to that law. In other words, the Pope, at that instant, when Christopher Columbus slammed the papal flag into the ground, the Pope was both the priest and the king of this hemisphere. The priest and the king. He, being Antichrist, also claims to be, like Christ, a priest and a king. He is all-powerful over spiritual things and all-powerful over temporal things. And no matter what government arises in this Western Hemisphere, if it deviates from the papal dictation, it may be borne with only until such time that it can be overthrown, as prudence dictates. Now it says, these ideas, somewhat remitted heretofore from necessity and prudence, have acquired additional strength from the dogma of papal infallibility. Okay, when you add the divine characteristic of infallibility to the Pope, it makes him even more of a god than he would have been had he not been declared infallible and divine. And so it just adds strength to the claim. Papal infallibility only adds strength to the claim that the Pope is the supreme and unchallengeable power in the world, and particularly the Western Hemisphere is what we're talking about right now. He says, they are now avowed with great emphasis and vehemence by the ultramontane authorities at Rome. For people who've never heard that word defined, ultramontane just simply means the ultra-conservative Roman Catholic power that insists that the papacy is the God of this world. Full stop. Okay, the ultramontane, whenever you hear the word ultramontane, such a word is used to describe the Jesuits and other of the extreme papists' doctrines in the world, is described as ultramontane. Whenever you hear that word, you're talking about the most radical papists in the world. He says, they are now avowed with great emphasis and vehemence by the ultramontane authorities at Rome, who are seemingly the more pertinacious in their advocacy in proportion to the resistance of them by the progressive nations, that is, by the Protestant nations. And it says, a new life of Columbus has lately appeared, a book about the life of Christopher Columbus. It was written in French by Delorc, but has been translated and published in this country. Anyone who will carefully read this book will see that one design of it is the inculcation of the idea of papal supremacy in America. Speaking of the preparation of Columbus for his work of discovery, by penance, prayer, and the meditation of divine things, the author says this, quote, his expedition takes the religious character of its origin and object. He gives the name of the Blessed Virgin to his ship and hoists the cross in her. He departs on a Friday and commands the sails to be unfurled in the name of Jesus Christ. It is the name Jesus Christ that he takes possession of the lands he discovers. It is to honor the Redeemer that he erects crosses everywhere he lands, unquote. Okay? Stamping the papal flag on every piece of terra firma that he sets foot on in this hemisphere. He is described not only as the first who carried the cross to the New World, but as, quote, the herald of Catholicity and the tacit mandatory of the papacy, unquote. It is said that, quote, he presents the Holy See with an opportunity or occasion of showing the spirit of infallible sagacity that perpetually inspires the church, etc. Events are recited to establish for him, quote, the character of apostolic legate, with which he showed himself invested in his acts by his pretensions, unquote. It is declared that, quote, evidently God chose Christopher Columbus as a messenger of salvation, unquote. And treating the discovery of America as a fact accomplished in accordance with the divine decree, it is said that by means of it, he, quote, enlarges the known surface of the earth, brings nations, as it were, nearer each other, and expands the domain of the Catholic Church, unquote. So there you have it. This author in this book treats Christopher Columbus as a papal legate assigned with the purpose of extending the jurisdiction of the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church. So that's how the papacy views the discovery of this hemisphere by Christopher Columbus, an extension of the divine right to rule by the Pope. And it says he is called a saint even without canonization because, quote, as a hero of the gospel, unquote, and a, quote, great servant of the church and messenger of the cross is found as regards history in him. And finally, in assigning the discovery of, quote, the infallible wisdom of the church, unquote, he sums up by saying that, quote, the history of Columbus contains the glorification of the Catholic Church. It shows the spirit of light which always guides the papacy in the government of intelligence, unquote, which assigns all the honor and glory of the discovery to the papacy alone and treats the agency of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain as merely secondary to it. So there you have it. The papacy by Christopher Columbus claims divine right rule of the Western Hemisphere. And just the point that I want to make is, you know, we've all been taught about the Puritans and how they came to this country fleeing Roman Catholic tyranny and persecution and burnings at the stake and the Inquisition and all the tortures and confiscation of their property and the stealing of their children to be raised up in Roman Catholic nunneries and just intolerable tyranny and persecution, that they fled Europe and came to this country to have religious liberty, but Rome had already claimed the place. Rome had already taken steps that she was going to control this hemisphere, lock, stock, and barrel, and not to be challenged by any temporary setbacks by Puritans or Protestants, heretics all, to be overthrown whenever the opportunity presents itself by divine right. Now, the papist who by this process of reasoning argues himself into the belief that this enlargement of the domain of the Catholic Church, we're talking about the conquering of the Western Hemisphere, conferred higher jurisdiction upon the papacy than that acquired by Ferdinand and Isabella by virtue of the right of discovery and the law of nations, because the papal rights are divine and the royal rights, that is, of Ferdinand and Isabella, were only human, and has no difficulty in reaching the conclusion that the Pope obtained by means of it a degree of authority within the new domain, the Western Hemisphere, which cannot be impaired by the employment of illegitimate power or a resort to revolution and usurpation, which with him are convertible terms. So the Revolutionary War was a usurpation of papal authority. That tells you who was really in control of England during the time of the Revolution, doesn't it? The papacy was in control of England, and it was the papacy who intently sought to separate the colonies from Great Britain, so that Roman Catholicism could rule and reign under a constitutional decree of religious liberty, so that Roman Catholicism could eventually grow to a controlling power and consummate what Christopher Columbus started, to hand over this country and this hemisphere to the Pope on a silver platter. That's the New World Order. Remember, during the colonial period, the Catholics represented about 1% of the population. If the papacy was going to make good its claim on the Western Hemisphere, he had to realize and use prudence with regard to his governance of that 1% of the colonial population, because the rest of the population were Protestants and Puritans and non-Catholics of every description. And they were all well aware of the persecutions in Europe. That's why they came to the colonies in the first place, to flee papal tyranny. Now, had the Pope exerted himself too vigorously in the United States, or had the Roman Catholic Church in the United States become too vocal, or shown any signs of the historical characteristic of Roman Catholicism, the overwhelmingly non-Catholic population of this country would have wiped out that 1%, and all holds would have been barred to the papacy. The papacy would not have only lost the colonies, who would have been declared Protestant, but eventually would have lost his control of the entire Western Hemisphere. Prudence, extreme prudence, was used by the papacy at the behest of the Jesuit priest John Carroll, the first bishop of the United States of America, at a time when the Jesuit order had been suppressed by a papal bull, wrote a letter to the Pope admonishing him to stay off, to remain quiet and allow the Roman Catholic Church to govern itself and to establish its own bishops until such time as they could take over the country for the Pope. That day, ladies and gentlemen, has arrived. Prudence paid off, big time. And now once Protestant America is Roman Catholic. And now prudence thrown aside, we're going to see untold changes in the governmental structure of this country. America's becoming Catholic by virtue of the conquest of the Western Hemisphere by its discovery by Christopher Columbus. The Pope has made the earth his footstool. And once his jurisdiction is established, it can never be taken away. And it says, undoubtedly, the popes have thus reasoned in reference to the jurisdiction they acquired over all nations once submitted to their authority. And when this jurisdiction has been suspended or disturbed for a time by forces they could not resist, they have not hesitated to reassert it when the occasion offered, and to insist upon resuming it when these forces were overcome or withdrawn. Now, this you can take to mean that the United States government, the de facto government of the United States, though it is an established and consummated fact in the world, makes no difference whatsoever. Whenever it's possible, the popes, using prudence so as not to irreparably harm the church, will take over the country. This is the assessment of R.W. Thompson, that if this government ever falls, it will fall at the hands of an internal power, and that power is the Roman Catholic Church. He says they have maintained that neither time nor circumstances of whatever nature could operate in bar or limitation of their right, for the reason that it is derived from God, and that therefore everything in conflict with it is wrong and usurpation. They have never been known to abandon any jurisdiction, and the rights arising out of it, exercised by them over any nation, however remote may have been the period of its exercise. In the case of Great Britain, for example, their theory supports and in their view justifies the claim that as Gregory I introduced the Roman faith there, and the early Saxon kings became converts to it and submitted to the jurisdiction of the Pope, and other kings did the same thing, especially John, who consented to hold the crown and the country in fief to the Pope. Therefore, they acquired a spiritual supremacy there, which, whatsoever consummated facts may have since transpired, has lost none of its original validity or legitimacy. They do not acknowledge that the statute of limitations or any analogous principle of the law of nations can run against the papal rights over either nations or individuals, because they have the stamp of the divine sanction. Their reasoning is based upon the ideas that Christ entrusted to them the keys, giving to them thereby the power to bind and to loose in heaven and upon the earth. That this power is necessarily plenary, in other words, all-encompassing, and confers upon them, that is the popes, the right of spiritual government over all nations and peoples brought under the influence of Christianity. The extraordinary nature of this claim is not more startling than the manner of its exercise, whenever there have not been sufficient means to compel it. Examples already referred to in a different condition, as illustrating other aspects of the papal question, bear directly on this point. It was by virtue of this jurisdiction that Pope Alexander II blessed the banner of William the Conqueror and gave him pontifical permission to dispossess Harold, the legitimate king of Great Britain, and occupy the country in the name of the papacy. In support of it, he and his successors sent an army of legates to the Italian monks into the country in order to extend the pontifical dominion, and according to the historian, quote, they carved and clipped ecclesiastical matters as they pleased. In other words, no rule applied. They dictated the rules of their takeover of England. Okay, the people had nothing to say about it. The king had nothing to say about it. The Pope had spoken. I hereby declare you the king of England. Here are all my legates. Now take over the country. Irrespective of any sentiments, any religious beliefs of the country, I am the God of this world, and you will take over England in the name of the Pope. Now, it was under the same claim of authority that Gregory VII pronounced his anathemas against Emperor Henry IV and stirred up against him an insurrection in favor of Rudolph, without any regard to the wishes or desires of the German people. And the papists, not being disposed to attempt a direct justification of his enormous pretensions in an age of so much enlightenment as the present, have resorted to various subterfuges to escape the consequences of his bold and defiant demands. An effort has been made by a learned papal writer, which has the merit of great ability, to show that Pope Gregory VII, quote, did not pretend to ground himself merely on the divine power of binding and loosing, but on the laws of both God and man, unquote. He does not by any means make this clear. On the contrary, his shifting of position merely suggests the impossibility of drawing the line in ascertaining the extent of papal power between the laws of God and those of man. For if the power is divine in any sense, it must be plenary and not dependent upon human consent. Bellarmine, the Jesuit priest with more ability, called it indirect power, distinguishing it from direct, the ground also taken by Cardinal Antonelli in his letter to the French ambassador heretofore alluded to. What is meant by this, however, is that in the papal states the power of the Pope is direct, whereas outside their limits and elsewhere throughout the world it is indirect. But there's no difference in degree, it being the same wherever it exists. Thus we find it laid down by Peter Dens in these words, quote, Bellarmine, Sylvius, and others say that the Pope has not, by divine right, direct power over temporal kingdoms, but indirect. That is, when the spiritual power cannot be freely exercised, nor his object be obtained by spiritual, then he may have recourse to temporal means, according to St. Thomas, who teaches that princes may sometimes be deprived of their rule and their subjects be liberated from the oath of fidelity, and thus it has been done by popes more than once, unquote. The Jesuit Bellarmine is supposed to be the author of this doctrine, but as he lived in the 16th century, 500 years after Gregory VII, the latter, of course, had no idea of any other kind than direct power. And being an infallible pope, the opinions of a mere cardinal, however distinguished, cannot be set up against his. Nor do they avail much against the opinions of St. Thomas, who is regarded as one of the foremost of the fathers of the Roman Catholic Church. As represented by Dens, St. Thomas merely refers to the exercise, but not to the origin of the power. When, however, he does refer to the origin of it, he says, quote, that according to the institution of God himself, the King of Kings, the Pope possesses the highest degree of both powers, the spiritual and the temporal. Now, I've said repeatedly on the broadcast that the papacy sees itself as the earthly King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And this is where it comes from. This is not just a blind assertion on my part. This is the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. This is according to Peter Dens and Thomas Aquinas. It says that according to the institution of God himself as King of Kings, the Pope possesses the highest degree of both powers, the spiritual and the temporal, unquote. So this is canon law. This is how the Pope acquires to himself the title King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he exercises that power. He acts on that authority, establishing himself by his actions as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He not only claims with his mouth the blasphemous title, but he exercises the blasphemous power. And it says, and Cardinal Dostia, however you care to pronounce it, makes a more practical application of the doctrine when he asserts that, quote, since the coming of Jesus Christ, all the dominion of infidel princes was transferred to the Church and is vested in the Pope as the vicar of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. Whence he infers that the Pope can, by his own authority, grant the kingdoms of infidel princes to any of the faithful whom he may think proper to select, unquote. See, not only does he claim to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he acts on his blasphemy. And it says, but although Thomas Aquinas sustains the direct and Bellarmine the indirect power, they agree in its application according to the principle laid down by Dostia. In justifying Popes Gregory III, Stephen III, and Leo III in seizing upon a number of Italian provinces after the emperors of the East had separated from the Roman Church and united with the Eastern Christians, thus becoming heretics, they both, quote, maintain that the Church and the Pope could have declared the pagan emperors of Rome, and especially Julian, deposed from the empire and their subjects absolved from all obligation toward them, if such a declaration had been consistent with prudence, unquote. So, you see, the Pope leaves no limit to his jurisdiction over kings past, present, and future. Is this not Antichrist? Should we look for an Antichrist in the future when the real Antichrist has been on the earth all the time? It says the fact is this theory of indirect power is an afterthought. It had no existence in the minds of ambitious popes who laid the foundation of papal power and under whose administration that power was made to overshadow the world. With them, Gregory VII, Innocent III, Adrian IV, Boniface VIII, and all the rest, the pontifical power was direct, full, plenary, omnipotent, derived immediately from God. They denied that it was in any sense indebted to human grants or concessions, or that it could be enlarged or diminished by them. When, however, Protestantism began its work, and the papacy reeled and tottered under the blows of the great reformers, it required the genius and ability of Bellarmine to conceive and promulgate the idea of indirect power, so that the assailants of the direct power might be answered with an argument that was at least plausible. It is said that he was driven to the theory of indirect power by the desire of vindicating the popes and the clergy of the Middle Ages against the attacks of Protestants and of the more ancient heretics, and that he believed that he struck the middle and more proper course between the excesses of heresy and the opinion of the direct power, which he considered to be manifestly extravagant, unquote. In other words, the papacy claiming the divine right of power, the divine right of God to rule the world, arrogating to himself God's title, God's power, and God's jurisdiction, had to come up with a way of explaining how this infallible, divine, omnipotent, and omniscient Pope could have lost during the Protestant Reformation. And it simply says he didn't lose anything. He may have lost his direct power, but that simply reverts to the indirect power. You see how Rome plays the game? Unwilling to admit defeat. But this act of adopting this doctrine of the indirect power is simply a way to explain away the Pope's failure, his human status, his infinitely wicked status, his Antichrist status in the world. You see, he really doesn't have any power at all in the world. If the whole world just simply walked away from the papacy and quit obeying his stupid laws and quit believing him to be anything but a man that sits on a pot like you and I, the world would be rid of it. And the Pope would simply die for lack of a supporter. And that's literally what took place during the Protestant Reformation. The knowledge that the Pope was the biblical and historical and prophetic Antichrist, and that with that knowledge, the whole Roman Catholic Church started marching out the door in protest, and all the kings of the earth accepted the Protestant theory, took back all the lands that they had held in captivity to the Pope, restored the produce of all that land to the people of the countries in which they lived. The papacy was about to die for a lack of support. See, it's already been demonstrated in history how to destroy the papacy. That the world could just come to its senses and comprehend the biblical and prophetic teaching as written in the King James Version of the Bible. There can be no other candidate for papacy anywhere in world history than the papacy. There can be no other Antichrist. It is, was, and always will be the papacy. That is the historicist view of Bible prophecy. That you can't detect Antichrist unless you see his fulfillment in history, and all you have to do is study history. That's why I'm reading this book. History leaves no other candidate for Antichrist than the papacy. The Protestant reformers realized this. That's why they left the Roman Catholic Church. That's why they proclaimed Christ their true king. The papacy was just withering away. And it had to act if it was ever going to survive, and it had to act fast. And so they solicited the help of two Jesuit priests, Alcazar and Ribera. Alcazar came up with an alternative interpretation of Bible prophecy that put the Antichrist way off in history. It had to be one of the Caesars of Rome, Nero, and he was overthrown by the Roman Catholic Church, they say, and the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope became the Christ. Okay? Well, that didn't sway enough people, so they came up with the most popular form of explaining away the knowledge of Protestantism. They said, well, the Antichrist can't come until the last 7 years of time, just before Christ's return. And believe it or not, the prevailing belief among those who call themselves Protestants today believe that lie. And because they believe the lie, they're going to lose Protestantism altogether. This country is going to become Catholic. And the government is going to enforce Roman Catholic canon law on all the people. They're going to replace God's law with Roman Catholic canon law. They're going to replace Christ with Antichrist. They're going to take away your King James Bible and give you a shovel. And if you won't accept the shovel, and if you won't lay down your life for the Pope, and if you won't kneel and genuflect before the Eucharist at the Roman Catholic Mass, your head will fall in a basket prepared for you and everyone like you. And this isn't just a dream. This is history. The earth is soaked with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus who have fallen to the power of Antichrist. Nothing has changed. The earth is no more civilized today than it ever was. The papacy is no representative of Christ at all. He is the representative of Antichrist. Now, if the great popes who originated, maintained, and acted upon the doctrine of the direct power were infallible, and the dogma of the late Lateran Council make them so, then this doctrine became an essential part of the faith of the Church, which it would now be heresy to deny or to change. It is a vain pretense, therefore, to talk about the indirect power as Cardinal Antonelli does, it being merely the ingenious argument of a Jesuit of the 16th century, not promulgated by authority as part of the faith, but as a mere shelter for the enormities practiced under the claim of direct power. If it be the faith of the Church, if it be that the faith of the Church is immutable, in other words, unchangeable, and the popes all infallible and incapable of error, then the doctrine of the indirect power is heresy. Or if the promulgation of it from the Vatican under the official auspices of the present Pope, that is Pope Pius IX, makes it a necessary part of the faith at this time, then the popes who maintained the direct power were heretics. In other words, R.W. Thompson saying, you can't have it both ways, Pope. It says, let the papist take either horn of the dilemma, and his theory falls to the ground as utterly untenable, alike opposed to the divine and human law and the best interests of mankind. It is apparent, therefore, that Gregory VII did not pretend to shelter himself behind any indirection, and that in asserting his primacy and supremacy he required it to be recognized as part of the faith, that the power of the Pope over both spirituals and temporals was derived directly from God and was not susceptible to any human limitation. This is the fair and only import of his language, previously quoted, and of all the official acts when dealing with the European kings. Even in dealing with King Philip, King of France, the favorite son of the Church, he forbade him lay investiture and addressed a letter to the French bishop declaring that if they did not obey him, the Pope, and not the king, to whom by the law of France they owed allegiance, quote, he would, with God's help, use every means to wrest the kingdom of France from his hands, unquote. That's direct power. And it says, and his labored exertions to establish a holy empire or ecclesiastical state in the form of a revived Jewish theocracy indicates how completely, if he had succeeded, he would have absorbed all the spiritual and political power of the world. And trust me, ladies and gentlemen, that's what the New World Order is, the absorption of all spiritual and all political power in the world into the breast of the papacy. And it says, nor did Adrian IV, Innocent III, or Boniface VIII, up to the beginning of the 14th century, pretend to rest this supremacy upon any other ground than that asserted by Gregory VII. The blight of the Middle Ages was resting upon the world during their pontificates, and there was no necessity for moderation or disguise. Reason was not then free to expose or to combat their errors or usurpations. There was no free thought or free speech or free press in those days. Protestantism was not then born. The iron weight of the papacy rested upon all the nations, and even kings so crouched at the feet of these great pontiffs as to cause Dante to exclaim, how many now hold themselves mighty kings, who here like swine shall wallow in the mire, leaving behind them horrible dispraise. That's a declaration of Antichrist, isn't it? Dante was right. Protestantism has lost its way. They can no longer call themselves Protestants. I'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.